So our guest today is Sophie Daniels. She's the head of the Songwriting Program, Masters of Arts founder at the Institute of Contemporary Music Performance in London. She has worked in, she writes within the Americana folk pop genres, and her former roles in with major labels have been Sony UK, S Records, and she worked directly with Simon Cowell, our favorite fellow from American Idol. So please give a warm welcome to Sophie Daniels.
Thank you, Odie. Okay, yeah, so just to tell you a tiny bit of background about me, Odie mentioned already that I worked in the music industry for about 10 years before I went into songwriting education. I worked at the BBC in a music department. I then worked at Sony Music for a few years, and then I went to work for what was then called S Records, which became Psycho, which was Simon Cowell's label, and I worked with lots of big recording artists, in particular Westlife, who were a very big selling boy band at the time. And then 18 years ago, I moved into songwriting education as well as being a writer, kind of part-time on the side, and then went more formally into education. And for most of that time, I've worked at what's called ICMP, the Institute of Contemporary Music Performance in London. I've worked at a number of different, taught at most universities who teach contemporary music in the UK as well as internationally. I recently became an associate professor of songwriting in the UK, and mostly that was in recognition of my work in songwriting education. So as Odie said, I founded the department in London, and I launched the first BA in songwriting in the UK, and designed and ran that for 6 years. And I've designed and run programs within all different levels in the UK, within further education and higher education, and now postgraduate education, as well as non-accredited programs, evening courses and summer schools, so on. I also have an artist performing project, which is the Liberty's Mother project, and I released my first EP with that in 2019. That is a charitable research project. I work with an organisation called the Songwriting Studies Research Network, which is an international organisation that I recommend to you. It's for anybody who's interested in songwriting, students, professional songwriters, academics, researchers, and it's a great way to meet people. It is based in the UK, but we've got lots of international members. And I'm also a director of an organisation called the F List, which is a UK community interest company set up to address gender inequality in UK music. And finally, the other little shot there is the research project that I'm going to tell you something about today, which is my Why We Write Songs research project that I'm doing in partnership with ICMP and the SSRN. Yeah, and that's the theme of today's talk. I'm going to talk to you about why we write songs. And I'd like to draw some discussion and learning about what we can all, as songwriters across different types of practice, learn from each other and learn from looking at different types of songwriting practice. And I really recommend to all of you to be interested in and maybe to seek to involve yourself with different types of songwriting practice over the course of your career. I think you'll find that really rewarding and beneficial, and also you'll find that there are revenue streams in other areas of practice as well as commercial writing. So what I'd like to talk about this afternoon is my research project, Why We Write Songs. I'm going to touch on what is a song and what is songwriting. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different types of songwriting practice that I've been researching and discussing with different practitioners. I'm going to seek to compare across the different types of practice and then hopefully draw some conclusions at the end that we can think about and talk about together. So, first of all, I'd like to give you an introduction to the research project that I've been running since 2020. It's still ongoing, which is called Why We Write Songs. This is a community research project, by which I mean that I'm conducting research within the songwriting community, within the international community of all songwriters, students, academics, teachers, all different kinds of songwriters. And in particular, I'm conducting that with the Songwriting Studies Research Network and where I work, ICMP, where we have about 35 to 40 people who teach songwriting, and they're all practitioners as well, our graduates and alumni, and our student body there. I have 60 people studying on my master's program in London. It's the biggest master's program in the world. And we have, I think, between about 85 to 90 people on the undergraduate program. And we have a very family kind of community at ICMP. So we stay very networked with our graduates as well. So this is my kind of motivations for setting up this research project and the ethos of it as well. Probably around 8 years or so ago, I remember, because I was pregnant with my youngest, I started to realise that songwriting students were becoming interested in different things other than commercial writing. They were bringing songs, projects in the room that were about other things. They were commercially writing as well, but they were writing songs for other reasons. They wanted to explore their identity. They wanted to explore different purposes for their songwriting. And that was very interesting to me. It was starting to become clear that songwriting for a lot of people is about much more than having a hit, whatever that may mean to you. And I wanted to better reflect their interests and the interests of the community. And I became fascinated with all of the different reasons that human beings write songs. And I started to explore that and found some really interesting and surprising reasons for songwriting. A bit more recently, maybe starting there, but maybe sort of 5 years ago, I became aware of this conversation about how culture and capitalism created this particular moment in the second half of the 20th century for songs and songwriting, in that they were able to generate a lot of money for the music industry, a lot of money for anybody that was involved with them, and a lot of money to kind of feed the furnace of the record industry. And that's a great thing, generating income, of course, but that, because of all the different changes in our industry, we'd started to see that time maybe as being not over, but a discrete period of time which we're coming out of, and that was opening up new possibilities. I and many other people I know have a strong desire to equalise songwriting and equalise the conversation around songwriting. We know that songwriting is not equal. The statistics for gender and race in particular show us that songwriting, commercial songwriting, is not equal. I feel very passionate about equalising that. I also, having worked in the major music industry, am aware that community songwriting or research-based songwriting may be regarded as being very different. We might not be sitting in a room together talking about songwriting, and I think it's important that we do that, because I think that is one way that we can increase equality across industry as well. For example, 14% in the UK of those who make money out of songwriting identify as being female. 14, it's actually pretty similar in the States. But 95% of music therapists who are practicing songwriting therapy are women. And then there's different statistics across different types of practice. So I wanted to work within all these different communities in an inclusive way, bring people together to share notes. And I became really interested in seeking out songwriters who were writing songs for really interesting reasons. And I'm also increasingly interested in looking at cross-disciplinary research, what we can learn from all different areas of study about songwriting. So how am I conducting this project? Well, I'm doing it by talking to people. I'm doing it by making notes about what people say to me when I meet them at events, via email, wherever I find them. And I'm doing that more formally in meetings and in class discussions. Some of the people that I've talked about are multimillionaires through their songwriting. Sometimes it's only a snatched email or a text message, but I'm recording those conversations. I'm also having formal interviews with people that I'm recording as videos and putting them into storage. Some of them are case studies. I've done some curated roundtable events, which I'd like to tell you about in more detail, recorded with an audience. I've been doing a lot of reading and research in all different ways and pulling all of that together and collating quotes and conversations there, and I am also finally doing a survey with various communities to look at people's motivations for songwriting. And out of the project, I'm going to have certain outputs. I've got the roundtable discussions, which are 2-hour sessions that have been recorded and are available on a website. I'm going to show you that you can watch if you like. I'm giving presentations like this one, and I'll give more at the end of the project. There are 4 academic articles, 2 are written and are being published in the SSRN journal, and there will be a book next year. So these are the round tables, and there's a bunch of people who I've talked to, and we weren't sitting around a table, of course. Some of this was conducted during the pandemic, so we were actually on screen, but we were, as though we were sitting around a table, talking for 2 hours about our songwriting practice in a group of people who may not ordinarily sit and talk together about songwriting, and looking at questions that maybe we wouldn't normally ask about songwriting. And you can see there very much the value of this community project. I will give the website later for where these are all stored, and I'll just tell you about 3 of them. This is Roundtable 3. The first and second are also videoed, but they're not online at the moment. The first one was with my master's students and graduate student body, and the second one was with the ICMP songwriting faculty. But 3, 4 and 5 I think are more interested to the wider world. So here's an example of one. This is a 2-hour recording where we talk predominantly about why we write songs, and then we compared notes on creative process, and all sorts of other things. So the woman at the top left there is a woman called Professor Felicity Baker. She is the world's leading expert on therapeutic songwriting, and she wrote a great book on it that I thoroughly recommend to you. I thoroughly recommend it to commercial songwriters. I'll say why later. She's based in Melbourne, Australia. Is doing fascinating work. We've got a UK Ireland hit writer there, Pete Cunner. Bottom left we have Bonnie, who you may know. Do you know Bonnie Baker? Yeah, so she's a US hit writer, and I know Bonnie well. And then middle bottom, we have a guy called Dr. Kit Ashton, who is a songwriting linguistic activist. He's actually won quite significant chunks of research money to write songs and explore songwriting as a tool for linguistic activism. He's from the Isle of Jersey in the UK, where they have a language that is dying, and he is using songwriting to see if they can save that dying language. And then that's Julian Marshall, who is a teaching fellow where I work. So that's the third one that's available for you to watch. The second one was an all-female songwriting community roundtable. On the right, there's somebody else there that you might know, Mary Gauthier. If you don't have Mary's book, she's a Nashvilleian, if you didn't know. And if you don't have her book, Saved by a Song, it is a brilliant book about well-being and artistry and songcraft. And then top left, that is Miranda Cooper. I don't know if you will have heard of Miranda. It's unlikely you will, but she is the UK's most successful non-performing female songwriter. Quite a long caveat there, but you'll understand what I mean. So she's written a lot of big commercial hit records in the UK for people like Girls Aloud and Kylie Minogue. Then bottom left, we have Dr. Jo Collinson-Scott, who led a huge research project in Scotland called Distant Voices, where 5 universities and the Scottish Prison Service got together to write songs over a 5-year period with high-risk prisoners to find out if songwriting can be used as a tool for conflict resolution, and to ultimately unite high-risk prisoners with a purpose for becoming free from incarceration and making peace with their victims and their own families. And if anybody's interested in that, I can point you to the resources for that and the learnings that came out of it. They're all online. And then bottom right, we have Dr. Polly Polsma, who also teaches with me at ICMP. She also teaches at Cambridge University, and she's a leading expert on folk music, and particularly about the crossover between folk and English literature. And then the last one that we did, this is a kind of who's who of songwriting academics, which is a bit of a small nerdy group of people, but you may have heard of one or two of them. I don't know if you've heard of that artist in the middle there, Frank Turner. Has anybody heard of Frank Turner? He does tour America. He's a #1 artist in the UK. He's also written books about songwriting, very passionate songwriter and activist. And then we've got, songwriting academics. So in the top middle there, that's Dr. Simon Barber, who founded the Songwriting Studies Research Network. You've probably heard of Professor Pat Patterson, top right, who teaches at Berkeley. If you haven't, I recommend that you get his books about lyric writing and songwriting. Bottom right there is Professor Andy West, who founded he used to be a staff writer in Nashville, actually, and he founded the first MA in the world in songwriting. And then bottom left there's Professor Philip McIntyre, who's written 7 or 8 books about creativity, is probably the leading thinker, in my opinion, in the world in songwriting research. And that's another really good conversation I recommend to you. You might be thinking now, it'd be really interesting to see a list of all those different reasons why people write songs. And I am collating a list of those. From the project, I would say that I believe there are 4 or 5 very clear purposes, which are the most dominant ones at the moment. But I'm collating a list of between 30 and 40, what I would say are different reasons that at the moment throughout time, human beings have written songs. This is not an exclusive list, it's a list that I'm working on. There are some still to be added, it's still to be debated and discussed, but I'll show you that now and I'll let you read them. It's over 3 slides and you might find some of them surprising, and I'm happy to take questions about those. So, what are the reasons that we are writing songs? I can just pause for a minute. A lot of these I'm not going to mention or talk about again. Is there anything that anybody particularly wants to point out of interest or ask a question about in that list?
I was curious about the to encourage violence.
Yeah.
What was the source of that?
Yeah, it is very interesting. I was quite surprised to learn that in the UK you can go to jail for songwriting. In fact, 2 young men were given a 2-year suspended sentence. Now, when I say writing a song, it's actually about sharing the song that you've written rather than writing it. So in this case, it was 2 young men who had written a song. They work within drill, which is a form of UK music you may or may not have heard of, but it has issues with gang violence. So in this particular song, they're referring to their community and to another gang community, and it is, I say it's alleged, my friend who's a judge would correct me on that, it was proven in court that they were inciting violence with that song, so they were breaking the laws of hate crime by writing and performing that song.
So, like an extension on that, did you hear it, or did you have a sense of what, I mean, it seems like in terms of the, writing some long-form ballad, essentially, even coming up with something that is a chant as much of that's easily repeatable, isn't too complicated, short. I mean, what was the form that this stuff was written in?
So this is quite detailed, fast rap content. So that's what drill music is, and they were talking. I mean, I have heard it, and it's not allowed to be on the internet. But every time they take it down, of course, fans post because they have quite a significant following. So fans will post versions of it again. So it is available, and you can see it there. But they were given a 2-year. So they were given a warning for performing it, and then they performed it again at a venue in London called Coco. And they were given a 2-year suspended sentence for performing that song, and they're not allowed to perform it anywhere again in public because it breaks the law under our laws of hate crime. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It makes me, I don't want to dominate this, but it's interesting, it makes me think one of the other things notice here is for writing for propaganda, and if people are writing for these forms, be it for violence or propaganda, whether somebody is in a different kind of a creative headspace where you're writing for something really outside
Yeah.
yourself, or a movement, or an idea.
So it depends what you mean by propaganda, doesn't it? But there are several countries in the world where significant numbers of people are employed by the government to write propaganda songs. So North Korea is one, for example. And yeah, that's their job.
That would never happen here.
There's a fascinating piece in the Tori Amos book. I don't know if any of you've seen that. The book came out in 2020 called Resistance, about songs being banned on the TV and radio after 9/11. I mean, these things really say something to us about the power of songwriting. Songwriting is an incredibly powerful tool that we have on this planet. Anybody else want to ask a question about any of the motivations that I've mentioned, or we can move on and pick up on questions at the end?
I mean, was there anything that you learned that really knocked you out as compared to, all the other stuff that you saw, heard?
Yeah.
Maybe something that really,
The one about inciting violence is really interesting, and they actually give a 30-minute radio interview about it, and they were highly intelligent, and I thought really fascinating, defending their right to write that song. Again, I talked about this with my friend in the UK who's a judge, and again, she said, this is all irrelevant, Sophie, it's not to do with creative expression. They broke the law. And it's interesting to think about songwriting interacting with the law. What else really surprised me? I think the what we can learn between therapeutic and songwriting, commercial songwriting, which I'm coming to at the end, but that's really fascinated me. In fact, 5 universities in Melbourne and some other international universities have just won a big sum of money from Apple to create an app which is going to be helping dementia sufferers. And I think that's really fascinating, what we can learn for the therapeutic songwriters who are learning about how melody works in the brain, and what we can take forward from that in terms of therapeutic songwriting's ability to address brain function and the crisis we have in health around dementia.
another thing that comes to mind is what do you think is going to be the impact of AI on all of this?
That's really interesting. I haven't studied much about songwriting in AI. I have a colleague in the UK that's his area of interest, Dr. Simon Barber, and I think it's fascinating. I'm becoming more and more interested again in something I've learned from the therapeutic songwriters, which is how human is as a song form and how important the human voice is in songwriting. And when you think about how we receive voice on some of the records now compared to how we used to, what the impact of that is, I personally think that song is a uniquely human art form, and so I am not overly worried about artificial's intelligence kind of role within it, because I don't think that they can play that role of being human, because they are not. But if you're asking about the impact on commercial songwriting industry, that's a different conversation, not one that I'm kind of expert in anymore. Can we lose money to them? Maybe. I don't know. Them, that's an odd way to refer to AI, isn't it? Let's not go there, I'll start getting worried. Start thinking about Terminator. Okay, so what is song and songwriting? Seems like a pretty obvious question, right? But actually it's really important that we ask that, because not everybody means the same thing, do they? You know that, you're songwriting students. In musical communities, isn't it interesting how emotionally charged ideas can become about what is a song and what is not a song? And in my view, it's vital for any kind of conversation, whether it's academic conversations, whether it's discussions, seminars, lectures like this, or whether it's co-writing. If you and I go in a room together and we want to make something, we need to both know what it is we're trying to make. And if there's 10 of us, that's even more important, right? If 10 people are trying to make something different, you're probably not going to make something. So it's really important we work out what we're talking about. Quite recently, archaeological and neurological research has clarified that songs have been around as long as there were human beings. Now, that's really fascinating when you think about, do we need songs? Do we need to write any more songs? How important are songs to the human race? Well, we've had them as long as we existed. And I think they're becoming increasingly more important. So as I mentioned, it's interesting that these conversations get so emotional. I mean, that says a lot, doesn't it? We all care about song. It's very important to us. And there are many aspects about song as an art form which seem to be uniquely human. Song is also very portable, isn't it? It can be very inclusive. Songs are quite short and accessible. They can travel incredibly fast. They're very, very useful, very powerful as an art form. It's not surprising that anybody within the music industry has a commercial definition of what song is, although I've just mentioned that can also appear loose at times, can't it? A bit like when you talk to A&R people about song structure, and if it's not a verse or a chorus, apparently it's a bridge. And songs can sometimes just mean that thing that makes a noise that we can sell within the music industry. But usually within the music industry, it's a lot clearer. Elsewhere, not so much. So just thinking about academic definitions for a moment, and at the end I'll have a slide with some of the books that I recommend to you. But there are some great books now, not just instructional books about songwriting, but academic and more conversational texts about what song is and what songwriting is. Quite a lot of the academics to date have given very similar, quite safe definitions, such as this one from Professor Joe Bennett, defined in terms of lyrics and music, influenced and directed towards contemporary Western popular music culture. There's still quite a few words in there, aren't there, that are quite specific. A song is about Western popular music culture. Well, there's a great book I recommend to you called Songlines, which is about how songs were used as a means for survival amongst Aboriginal communities, how songs were used that people could map how to get to water. Songs were a means for survival. So I'd say my definition of song would need to be broader than Western popular music culture, because I'm interested in why any song ever has existed or exists. Professor Andy West, who I mentioned to you earlier, wrote a beautiful book called The Art of Songwriting. Andy was a staff writer here in Nashville actually for many years and was in a band with Roger Cook. And this is Andy's definition, which is more kind of engaging, but maybe still quite loose. Songs are mobile and portable works of individual accent that possess, with varying levels of effective, dynamic, intellectual, visceral, receptive, contrasting, expressive, literal and metaphorical qualities, words, performance, production, arrangement, and importantly, music. So the songwriting academics are trying to nail down what is a song. For about 4 years, I've been talking a lot with the therapeutic songwriting community, getting to know Professor Baker, getting to know Professor Adele Miller, who is the UK's leading expert on therapeutic songwriting. And the first thing that struck me was how their definition of song is quite different. So Professor Baker's definition is music, words, and the human voice. The human voice has to be part of song when we're talking about therapeutic songwriting. She also makes the point that any answer to this question will depend on who is being asked. The term is culturally loaded. Again, culture and the concept of something being culturally loaded, I think, is something that we're increasingly interested in commercial music as we start to think about equality. As we start to think about the messages that songs have the power to spread. At the moment in the UK, as my role as part of the F list, I'm involved in a conversation in Parliament about misogyny in song lyrics. It's important that we start to think about these things in our culture. So that first quote there, which I'll read in a minute from Mary Cohen and Catherine Wilson, is from a research study to do with songwriting and well-being, which I can give you access to if you're interested in. There are a number of really good research studies that have been done about songwriting and well-being recently. This is the only one where they sought to define what songwriting was, which I thought was interesting. And they say, we define songwriting as the lyrical expression of human thoughts and emotion through rhythmic, melodic and textual ideas. And they go on to say that for the purposes of their research study, where they're looking at song's ability to enhance certain individuals' well-being, in this case vulnerable individuals' well-being, that they're also including all songwriting. They're not just talking about the song as an artifact, or they're talking about the process and everything that surrounds the song, which I think is interesting as well. Normally when we talk about song and songwriting, we're not just talking about the song. We're often talking about the process, or we might be talking about the artistry or the video, or all of the things that live around the song rather than just the artifact itself. And I'm working towards my own definition. This is the first time I've shared it, and it might change a little bit, but I'll read it to you. Song is a communicative art form which humans create using voice, music and language to connect with and sometimes to understand ourselves and each other. I've become very interested in song's role in human connection, and I recommend another great book to you. It's had a big impact on me in this research, which is a book by a UK artist called Kay Tempest, K-A-E. And they wrote a book called On Connection, which is about song and live musics and also performance poetry's role in human connection, which is something I think we've become very interested in during and post-pandemic. And I would say is possibly the overarching purpose of all songwriting. Okay, I just want to talk a little bit more about what song is by talking about how we view songwriting. When I started in higher education, sorry about that typo there in viewed. When I started in higher education about 18 years ago, the first thing that I struggled with was that I noticed that in higher education in the UK, there was this idea that songwriting was a thing that was located within music. I think in songwriting communities, we don't tend to view songwriting that way, but it was interesting to me how in the broader music community and in the world, that songwriting is viewed as being something which lives within music, a part of music. And I was surprised by this, because that's not how I'd ever viewed songwriting. And I think songwriting community that I've talked to, many thousands of people, we tend to view songwriting maybe a bit more like this, that it's got a lot of common ground with music, a lot of common ground with creative writing, and some of its own ground too. And I've noticed with songwriting students how they've been interested and sometimes relieved when I've shared that visual with them. And I'd like to go a little bit further and say that I think there's lots of other really important things that connect with songwriting as an area of practice. I said earlier about cross-disciplinary research and study, and that's where I think music therapy lives. I think psychology is very relevant to songwriting, at least a good corner of it. I'm personally interested in criminology and psychology in songwriting. I must say at this point, disclaimer, this is not meant to be to scale or anything like that. And I'm not suggesting that if that circle doesn't coalesce with that one, that they've got no common ground. It's just the limitations of my own inability to draw circles, really. And I might go a little bit further and say that philosophy seems to occur in songwriting. To me, in fact, probably maybe more often than psychology. Think about how many country songs are really kind of grassroots philosophy, life philosophy. I'm interested in anthropology and songwriting. I just referred to it there with a book that I mentioned about songlines. So I think songwriting actually, and songwriting students in my experience tend to be interested in lots of different things and want to bring them into their songwriting. That's what I noticed when I noticed that change about 8 years ago. Okay, now I'd like to say something about 3 or 4 different types of songwriting practice that I'd like to focus on before I draw parallels between them. Commercial songwriting. I think you pretty much know what commercial songwriting is, and that the title makes it very easy to understand. It is the practice of writing songs to generate income for yourself or maybe for other people, certainly in Nashville. And there's some examples, of course, 2 of them are English. I don't know if you know about the new Ed Sheeran album, that's that yellow pack shot there. He's just talked a lot about the well-being aspect of writing that record, and that's been a big part of his social media campaign. And I think the conversation's changed quite a bit maybe with the Olivia Rodrigo record in relation to what female songwriting is and pop music. what I was really interested in when I've been interviewing the commercial songwriting community is how I haven't really found anybody yet, including several multimillionaires through songwriting that I've talked to, who are that interested in making money. And in fact, Roger Cook said similar things yesterday. He said, you know, it's great, I want to make money, this is fantastic, I want to have hits, I want people to hear my songs, but if I never had a hit again, I would continue writing songs for the rest of my life. I mean, that says to me it's not his number one purpose in writing songs. And I loved that quote. I don't know if any of you have seen the documentary called It All Begins With a Song. Has anyone seen that? The NSAI made it. It's available on Amazon. It's a great hour-long documentary, predominantly with Nashvillians. And there's a lovely moment when Jessie Alexander and her co-writer go to meet the father whose story they used when they wrote the song I Drive Your Truck. And she says, this is better than any royalty check, this moment right here. And that seems quite implicit in the documentary. Right, songwriting for well-being. Now, you know, we could say that all songwriting is songwriting for well-being. I'm sure that you feel that songwriting has an impact on your well-being. You might not have thought about that or noticed it, or you might have done. But it's certainly a tool that is useful to us as individuals, and it's a tool that's useful for us when we write with communities of people. And there are lots and lots of studies, lots of money going into this kind of work worldwide, particularly in Australia and the UK and in America, and it's something that you can involve yourself in without having any qualifications in therapy or clinical practice, and it's really rewarding. I'm going to mention the Mary Gauthier book again. Mary's Grammy nominated, but she says writing songs has helped me sort out confusion and untangle powerful emotions and ward off desperation. There's a quote there about rap, which I think is probably the most useful genre for songwriting as well-being that we have as a community. Governor B is a UK rap artist, and he wrote a particular song which connected with male community there about mental health. And that's from a radio program where he was talking about that song and about the connection between a song that he wrote about his desperation when he was thinking of taking his own life and the response that young men had to that. We can learn a lot in terms of songwriting for well-being from Felicity Baker's book, and she talks about the many different songs that songwriting can do. She talks about how songwriters verbally describe inner experiences and how that can alter the way that we feel about those experiences and has the potential for transformation. And then that final quote there is from a lovely book that Sarah Bareilles wrote about her practice, which is called Sounds Like Me. Something that probably nearly every singer-songwriter can connect with, a song as an emotional outlet where we store our experiences. Therapeutic songwriting is something which is still small at the moment, but I think is set to grow. And there's two great books there that I recommend to you. One I mentioned already, and another one, Therapeutic Uses of Rap and Hip Hop. There is the definition of what therapeutic songwriting is. Therapeutic songwriting is done within a clinical setting. In the UK, you must be trained and you must be accredited by a particular body to practice therapeutic songwriting. If you say that you're practicing therapeutic songwriting and you're not qualified and accredited, you can get into serious trouble. So it is a particular practice. But we know that songwriting is therapeutic nevertheless. And there's a quote there from the other book from Dougie Fresh. And rap in particular, I think, is really useful. Songwriting for social justice seems to be something which is growing in recent times. We've always been aware of the power of songwriting for social justice. Social justice is justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities and privileges within a society. Conversation around social justice is growing. And another quote there from Mary Gauthier, song tellers have power, they are not voiceless victims. Song is something that people can use to say things that they cannot say in any other way. And as a community, we accept that from song, whereas we wouldn't accept it in any other form. We wouldn't accept that maybe even in a lecture or in a speech. Songwriting has condoned the use of songs as a freedom of speech, where people can describe what is otherwise considered taboo. This is again from Professor Baker. This opportunity to speak out is empowering for people, for whatever reason, have been silenced. I just mentioned that I think songwriting for social justice is something which has really come to the fore, and that second quote there from Questlove was a call out that he put on Twitter. I don't know if you saw about this in 2014, where he asked the songwriting community, what are you doing? It cannot just be with hip hop. What about all the other genres of music? Why isn't anybody writing any songs to get involved in the politics of what's happening in America? And lots of artists responded to that. Some wrote songs. There was a beautiful Sarah Bareilles, John Legend song that you might have heard at that time. There were loads of great songs and albums that were written in response to that. And here's another quote from Questlove from a great documentary about hip-hop and hip-hop's effect in terms of social justice. And he's talking about Kendrick Lamar's All Right, which became this anthem for the Black Lives Matter music. And not intentionally, as was pointed out in the documentary, and I recommend that documentary to you as well. And I just want to talk for a minute about therapeutic songwriting, which at the moment, as I just mentioned, is still stored within music therapy. You must be a music therapist at the moment to practice therapeutic songwriting. I think that's not ideal, and I think it's set to change. And the colleagues I've talked to, including Professor Baker and Professor Adele Miller, think that too. And I think it's going to be quite interesting to see what happens with therapeutic songwriting. I think music therapy is, at the moment, is also stored within music. Is this a better alternative then? Is music therapy going to take from well-being and spiritual practice, and hopefully we may be able to practice songwriting, therapeutic songwriting, without having to be trained as music therapists? I hope so, I think so. I'm going to join with others and see if I can do something about that.
Are you familiar with Operation Song or Creative Vets here? We work with Operation Song once a year, where students and hit writers write with veterans for therapy and to tell their stories. And so we have several groups that do that, but not in an official, they're not trained, you know. The writers go through a little training. But.
That's amazing. I didn't know about Operation Song. I know about Songwriting for Soldiers that Mary Gauthier and Beth Nielsen Chapman have been involved with. And they have this leading PTSD expert who's on that project as well. I think it's great to see projects like that where we're getting a bit more intelligent about saying we can do this without therapists, as long as it's done intelligently and ethically. And I think that's something that songwriting students can contribute to in the future, and maybe even use to fund their commercial endeavours. So what's common about these different types of practice? All types of practice seem to me to think about purpose, why we're writing the song. All think about ethics in one way or another, or the boundaries within our songwriting. Commercial songwriters are very familiar with thinking about craft, how we write our songs. Other types are less familiar. And all types of songwriting have to think about process and method. And I'd just like to say a bit about each of those, and an example of where the conversations that I've been having have created great learning across different types of practice. So purpose, purpose can be a song brief, can't it? Purpose can be, let's go in the room and try and write like this. It can be an artistic vision or concept. It can be a community project. It can be a research question. But defining and examining our purpose in songwriting will always help us achieve our best work, whatever type of songwriting that we're engaged with. If you're involved in research-based songwriting, or probably Operation Song, or trying to access funding for linguistic activism, you will encounter ethics. I'm involved in a research bid at the moment in the UK. We have to fill in ethics forms at all sorts of organisations, which is really important and really interesting. But my question on that would be, what about commercial songwriting? Can we as commercial songwriting learn from other types of songwriting about our ethical considerations or our boundaries? If a middle-aged white hit songwriter goes in the room with a young woman of colour who's been signed to a major record label, and she wants to write songs about things she thinks are interesting, are there really no ethical considerations in that scenario? I absolutely think that they are. And then, is there any difference between commercial songwriting and artistic songwriting? If it's in the name of art, can we do anything we like? I mean, I don't know, maybe. Can we even break the law? I don't know, maybe. There's a concept within journalism which is the difference between self-regarding practice and other-regarding practice. Other-regarding would be a research project. I have to take in consideration other people and my social responsibility. And then there's self-regarding, which is as long as I don't break the law, I can do anything I want. I can be biased, I can be deceptive, I can even be offensive. Is it important that we defend the right to do that within art? I think so. How does that kind of go together with the conversation about commercial songwriting and co-writing? I think they're different scenarios. And then there's songcraft. I've been really interested by how communities outside of commercial songwriting don't know anything about songcraft, and maybe there's this kind of snobbery. Well, if you're writing a song and it's not meant to be a hit, who cares? Well, I care. I care in the projects that I've been involved with, in some cases even more deeply than when I've been involved in hit writing, that my message comes across. If I'm trying to do something powerful with my songwriting, craft is of utmost importance. And again, came across some really interesting instances where that was a really vital conversation. Craft, as we know, is key to getting any message across, key to achieving your purpose. And then there's process across different types of songwriting. We all need to think about, where do my ideas come from? How do I get them? How do I store them? How do I write them? How do I manage them? How do I consider which song titles to take into a room? Does it matter if we're in the park with a pad and a pen, or should we go in a studio and use lots of technology? This is process. And again, it's really important across all types of work, and we can learn from each other. I'm coming to the end, but I just want to tell you one little story to hopefully demonstrate why I think therapeutic songwriting is so important in commercial songwriting. So my Liberty's Mother project that I mentioned to you earlier is a project that I did with a particular charitable group within what's called the baby loss awareness community in the UK. And it was a project that I wrote songs, we raised money and awareness for my late daughter, who died in 2011. And I wrote a song called I Can Love You From Here. And that was the lead track of the project. And on one occasion, I played that song in the Houses of Parliament in London to a room full of people who were all on what's called the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Baby Loss Awareness. And this is a group of very powerful people, MPs, some of whom are famous in the UK, charitable, CEOs of charities, health leaders in the UK. And we'd spent 2 hours talking about some really important things to do with this topic, and everyone was fine. And then I played them my song. And everybody was fine till we got to the chorus when the melody kicks in. I actually modelled the melody and lyric of that song on an old country song. And when we got to the chorus, every single person in the room started crying. Every single person. Now, when I told this story to Professor Felicity Baker, who's the world's leading expert at therapeutic songwriting, she said to me, "Oh, but Sophie, I can tell you exactly why that happened." And I thought, gosh, I wish I'd known that when I was 21 and training to be a hit writer. Who doesn't want to know how to make every single person in the room cry when you get to the first chorus? I mean, if that's, something that you want the song to do. And it really opened my eyes to how this learning about brain and melody and lyric is really, really powerful if you want to be an expert in songcraft. So, just to draw a few conclusions before I ask for questions then, we can learn such a huge amount by comparing across the different types of songwriting practice. I hope I've demonstrated that to you today. It seems to be accepted that capitalism created this moment in history for song where it was kind of charged with generating a lot of money for everyone. And we're moving away from that. Doesn't mean song isn't going to continue to generate a lot of money, but we're seeing it in broader terms now. In my view, that moment in history infantilized songwriting as an art form. Why don't we think about song as having the power that theatre has or that film has? It does. In my view, it maybe has more power. And to some extent, we rob society of songwriters' other vital applications, social justice, for example, which are starting to come to the fore now. The transformational power of songwriting is becoming visible. So the Ed Sheeran record was really interesting to me. He's openly talking, the biggest kind of UK artist we have with his new record. He's saying this is all about my well-being and how I've navigated difficulties in my life. How important are well-being and therapeutic songwriting applications for the future? I think they couldn't be more important in terms of the contributions that they have to make. We have a worldwide crisis for young people's mental health. Songwriting, therapeutic songwriting, is incredibly powerful. It's cheap or free. It's inclusive. It's such a great tool that we can expand in our armory in terms of therapy and well-being. At the moment, we know that songwriting is unequal, and we know that we're trying to do what we can about equality, and I think songwriting can play a role in that through this broadening conversation. And I think that the role of the 21st century songwriter is more important than it's ever been. Why? Because of this business of connection. The pandemic showed us how much we need to connect with each other as human beings, and that's what song does. No other art form is like song for that, in my view. What can we do then? Well, this is something that I'm doing at the moment. I'm working with Greenwich University and Middlesex University and a charity partner in the UK. We've got some money together to do a pilot scheme to see if songwriting can play a role in helping UK care leavers. These are people 16 plus who have been raised in the UK care system, so they've been looked after children in the UK. They have terrible statistics in terms of their likelihood to be involved in the criminal justice system when they leave the care sector. Can we use songwriting to help these care leavers create a positive vision of their future selves? We're bringing together narrative, transformation, coaching and therapy, and we're bringing together things that have been proved within theatre, and that's what we're going to try and do. So that's just one example of the kind of things that could come out of this kind of looking at songwriting as a broader practice. There's the books that I mentioned to you. I will share these slides with you, so if you want to, and all my quotes and sources are there, so if you want to look at any of those afterwards, you can get hold of that slide. There's the Tori Amos book at the bottom that I recommended to you, which is called Resistance. And thank you very much. Do you have any questions for me?
So I have two questions. The first is, when you're talking about therapeutic songwriting, and there's also like the melody portion of everything, is there like any, or like I've heard, I guess, that frequencies and different melodies and stuff like that affect the way people's brains work. Is there research on that, or like, is that something that's used for that?
What do you mean affect the way people's brains work?
I'm not 100% sure. I've just heard that in passing. Like, it's just frequencies and certain melodies just affect people's brains differently. And like, if you use a certain type of melody or frequency, it will affect someone's brain chemistry or waves or something like that. I'm not exactly sure.
I haven't talked to the therapeutic songwriters about frequencies, but I have talked to them a little bit about melody, and I'm not an expert in therapeutic songwriting, but I want to learn more about this. But what's really interesting is how fast neuroscience is moving and neurological research, and that's something that I'm very interested in as a person who isn't a neurologist, but I'm attending like music and medicine conferences. What the therapeutic songwriters are looking at is the role that melody plays in relation to emotions and memories, and where melody lives in the brain and where language lives in the brain. And therefore, this work that they're doing around dementia, as I understand it, is to do with how songs trigger certain memories. And what I think the app is intended to do that they're developing is that you would be able, if you were caring for somebody that had dementia, you would be able to go, oh, this person's feeling like this, app, what song shall we play? And at the moment, this is largely to do with melody, in order to calm them, for example. So it's relatively new, these things that are being found out, but it's kind of progressing really fast. And the one place where you can find out about that in relation to melody at the moment is in the therapeutic songwriting community. But it's a fascinating area of research. I mean, this is an area of research that any of you who've got appetite to can get involved with as songwriting students. We need songwriters to do these things. There's no way that neuroscientists can do that on their own. There's no way that musicians can do that on their own because they don't know very much about songwriting. So these are things that you research for your dissertation, get involved with.
Have you ever been to the Highlander Center at all?
Nope.
It's southeast of here, but they've been really deeply involved in civil rights movement and union organizing, and music, has been a key part of that. I mean, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, they were involved with it back, before World War II. I mean, Rosa Parks was like not just a random woman on the bus. She was like a trained activist. She had come through there. What We Shall Overcome. I mean, a number of the really powerful songs of the civil rights movement came out of there. But music has been a pretty key part of their organizing. I mean, since as long as they've been there, and they're still in operation. It's not too far from here. I forget, they're kind of out in the sticks, but
Yeah, I'd love to go. That's really interesting. Thank you.
yeah, and there's it's powerful enough that when their main building was burned, had arson a year or two ago. So I mean, they're still there after all these years.
There are so many examples around the world of song's power to contribute, aren't there, to political and social justice movements and to galvanise communities. I think it's said that any kind of movement needs a song to bring it together, and particularly when it comes to peaceful demonstrating. And yeah, it's really interesting.
I was surprised, and I don't know if you said important or powerful, but the way I took it is songs aren't considered as powerful as or important as theater or film in our culture. And in my mind, maybe it's a difference in where we're from, but songs are more powerful. Like if you go to a sporting event, a certain songs play, like the power to unite a group of many different types of people.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's interesting.
It is interesting. It might be that I'm coming at this kind of from a UK, or even from, well, of course, I'm coming at it from a UK music business, white woman, my age, of course. We have to acknowledge that, I think, in terms of, but also in terms of the community conversations I've been having. But I think if you look at like the amount of money that's put into research, for example, it's quite hard to make a case for song's power in that way. But yeah, as you say, it's interesting how often songs are banned. We just had a radio debate in the UK a few weeks ago about the song Delilah and its connection with people making. There's a big issue with certain sporting events in the UK, that there's a spike in domestic violence after certain sporting events, and people were asking for the song Delilah to be banned and not to be sung at this sporting event because it is about domestic violence. And it's interesting how, I mean, in my view, I think we're quick to sort of say, let's ban that song, it's too powerful, but I'm not sure that we really acknowledge the power that it has in terms of funding and research and that kind of thing.
Interesting.
So your study, did it just go into audio and lyric, or did it also look into performance arts and like the visual aspects of this art?
That's an interesting question. So it's not really a research study, it's a community research project. So I'm not kind of like analysing data about what songs are or anything like that. But no, I'm really looking at songs and songwriting and process and craft and that kind of thing, rather than what happens to the songs as artifacts when they go off into the world. Although obviously I'm kind of drawing on what happens to songs like the example with the All Right, the Kendrick Lamar song. I mean, that wasn't intended. There is clearly a difference between purpose and then what happens to the songs. And I talk about that in the first article that I've written, because we know it's the case, don't we, that we can spend a lot of time thinking about what effect the song is going to have, but actually how any song is received by any individual is completely out of our control. So it's not that there's no relationship between those things, but we have to acknowledge both those things as being true. No matter how much I work at my songcraft and I'm clear on my purpose and write with the best person in the world, nevertheless, how you hear the song is particular to you and your life experience and everything that you think those words mean. And so yeah, I'm kind of playing with the words here, motivations and purpose and stuff like that, a little bit fast and loose. Any more questions or comments? Or
One thing that comes to mind about whether there's any sense of craft for songwriting in traditional societies, or whether there's an expectation that whenever you have a vision quest or some other means or mode of creating something, or is there a community sense of relating to craft or any of
yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, in a way it depends what you mean by craft, because we, you know, in this room we've got a very clear idea about what that means, and it's, you know, rhyme patterns and structure and all the different things that we look at. Could you argue that you know, songwriting is very interesting in terms of anthropology? Something else I'm not an expert on. I'm not an expert on anything really. Something else I'm not an expert on is anthropology. People write songs in all different communities, all over the world. But those songs, if it's written for a specific purpose, such as the songlines example, you know, it's still the case that they need to be a certain length and that they need to contain certain information, and that, you know, that there's still criteria set around the song. Could you argue that there are decisions about craft? I suppose you could loosely, right? I think where I'm kind of interested is in this business of songcraft in terms of other types of modern songs, where people, you know, let's say you're writing a song as a speech at a wedding, or you're writing a song in the well-being conversation, very much about kind of speaking your truth, you know, you're a marginalised member of society, that kind of thing. I think songcraft needs to be really empowered in those situations and in community songwriting, because it's just going to make the situations, you know, people are going to invest in it much more, and the songs are going to be more powerful as a result. And I think that can be a bit neglected in some of those situations.
That's an interesting conversation, because for me, coming from somebody that I enjoy Southern folk artists, and I don't want my folk artists trained. I like how they use different materials that are found materials to create, and the same with different dialects, say with even in the South. Like, maybe training is not what we want from community places where they're going to show different aspects of that community, you know what I mean? I
do know what you mean, but I think it depends what you mean by training and how you train people. And I think, you know, but that's a very kind of live transferable conversation, isn't it? I mean, on my songwriting program in London, I tend to, as you observed yesterday, I tend to have more singer-songwriters than people who are writing for other people. And I often get students who are very nervous about learning things. They're really worried they're going to lose the ability to be themselves and, you know, use their own language, and that's hopefully not the case, but it does very much depend maybe where you study songwriting and who you study it with, which is where I would think about ethics and ethical boundaries. You know, I would never ever tell a songwriting student what language they should use. I would challenge them to just think as carefully as they possibly can about their choice of language, and make sure then it's from them and not from me. I would never tell any, you know, this is kind of getting into artistic songwriting, which is where I've had a lot of students in that area. You have to be very, very careful when you're treading all over somebody else's art. But I think if you are encouraging them to engage with craft in a way that empowers every decision that they want to make for themselves from their place, rather than saying, you know, no, it's got to be like this, or, you know, if you're a woman writing a love song, you have to be a survivor, these kind of things that irritate me greatly, that are handed down as doctrine in the A&R industry, that seems to me irresponsible, and that kind of training, I think, could spoil people's artistry. So I think it depends how you do it. Any further questions?
So like in this research that you've done, how has your research like affected your own songwriting craft and even like your teaching of other people?
That's a really good question. How's it affected my craft? Well, I'm not interested in commercial songwriting. I actually haven't been probably for 10 years or so. I mean, for various reasons. Some of them are logistical. The kind of writing I do, I would have to relocate here to Nashville. That just wasn't feasible for me. But I'm also more interested in just learning more about new things all the time. And so, I mean, that's why I followed this kind of research. But I have found that my research has had a massive impact on what I want to write. At the moment, I'm writing new songs for the Liberty's Mother Project, which is not to do with parenting. It's kind of feminist awareness raising. So I'm exploring how I can write songs deliberately to explore content, which it seems to me that I'm being told that I shouldn't write about, and writing songs in ways that it seems to me might be upsetting or unsettling to other people. And I'm doing that with a female community, co-writing songs with a female community. So I suppose I'm using my songs to explore more. And I'm really interested in songwriting social justice research projects. So I'm very passionate about this project, working with young care leavers, because I think, I really hope that I can start to work with communities to find tools that songwriting can be used for to positively influence people's futures. And so I'm working on that, writing songs with people to explore that as well, vulnerable people in different communities, to try and do that. So I'm kind of putting my efforts of songwriting in different ways, which I just find, you know, I'm older than you students, and I just want to continue learning. And I find that that's a great way for me to learn and continue to grow. And I think for all of you, as well, as you go through your life in songwriting, I'm sure you'll all want to write songs your whole lives. You might not want to do commercial songwriting at some point. And I think that's a good way that you can, through research, you can empower more songwriting for yourself. And you can use songwriting for your own well-being as well. It's probably the most powerful tool that I have for my own well-being. And it's free and accessible to you whenever you want it. Yeah.
You kind of touched on this in your last answer, but what is like the best advice you could give to like young females who want to really get into this industry, especially as a songwriter?
Okay. Well, I've been asked that question before. I think the best advice I could give you is to really invest in empowering yourself, because the kind of power systems and the difficulties that exist are going to continually say, well, why don't you do this? Or I think you should do that, or you can't do that. And you need to just continually be strong enough to say, really, why? Why does it matter why do I need to be a survivor in this song? It seems to me that it's women who are going to buy my records, and that they as an audience might be interested in what I have to say, and that you may not have that life experience, but tell me more. You know, that was a bit kind of difficult, wasn't it? Maybe you can say that in a nicer way. But I would keep asking why, and I would keep empowering your own artistic vision. In this business, whatever kind of songwriting you want to do, you have to believe in yourself. You have to work incredibly hard, but you have to believe in yourself. And if you think something is wrong, you need to be able to say, but I think that might be wrong. Or, but why? Why does it matter if you think that I dress in this way? Because I don't think whether I look sexually attractive to other people is relevant to me selling this record. And I don't think there's any case for that. I don't think there's any revenue for you in that. You know, I would just keep asking those questions and investing in yourself and trusting yourself, because you are probably right.
Thank you for Sophie. It's good.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Odie.